Falcons have completed their coordinator hires as Raheem Morris is continuing to build his staff. Welcome into an at-home edition of Falcons Today by Chat Sports. Matthew Peterson here breaking down the latest on the Falcons coaching news from my kitchen. So let's get right into it because we had the Falcons hire Zac Robinson, the Rams pass game coordinator, joining Raheem Morris in Atlanta as their offensive coordinator over the weekend. And now we get the DC hire and then the special teams coordinator retaining, if you will. But Jimmy Lake is the new defensive coordinator in Atlanta. He fills Ryan Nielsen's shoes after he was allowed to go interview elsewhere and then join the Jacksonville Jaguars. And the DC hire definitely pops out a little bit more to me because that was a bold decision, I'll say, by Atlanta to let Ryan Nielsen walk after the Falcons had a very successful 2023 defense. The first time they've had any sort of defense to be proud of, to be honest with you guys, for nearly half a decade. So let's talk about Jimmy Lake first because we already got the Zac Robinson news a little bit earlier this week. And then we'll kind of wrap up the video by talking about Marquice Williams. That's the special teams coordinator. If it sounds familiar, that's because he's been the special teams coordinator since 2021. So Raheem Morris is retaining him. But Jimmy Lake comes in as the new DC. So let's get some background information really quickly on Jimmy Lake for you guys. So background information on Jimmy Lake that I've got. This past season, he spent with the Rams as their assistant head coach. Now, before that, he was Washington's head coach. Not the Commanders, but the Huskies, Washington football over in the Pacific Northwest. He was their head coach for 2 seasons, ultimately got replaced by Kalen DeBoer, and the rest is history. But before he was the Washington head coach, he was their DC for 2 seasons. And before that, he was their co-defensive coordinator / DB's coach. In fact, he was on their coaching staff, specifically on the defensive side, from 2014 all the way until 2021. So if we think about what has Washington football produced on the defensive side of the defensive side in the last couple of years, specifically in the DBs department, because that's where Jimmy Lake specialized, a couple of names come to mind. Trent McDuffie for the Kansas City Chiefs. He was a first-round pick. He has been awesome for KC so far. We also had Kyler Gordon get drafted in 2022 as well as McDuffie. He was a second-round pick. I don't think he's been as big of a hit as McDuffie has been in Chicago, talking about Kyler Gordon, but he has definitely been a serviceable and a starting caliber cornerback in this league. So 2 starting cornerbacks coming out of Washington. And when I think about Washington football, I don't think like that's DBU. No, that's Ohio State and that's LSU. So give credit to Lake for developing and getting those 2 guys up to the NFL and not just getting into the league as day 3 picks, but day 1 and day 2 draft picks. There's also been some other notable guys that have come out of Washington. Vita Vea definitely pops up to my mind, but he was on the defensive line, and sure, he was still under the overall control, if you will, of Jimmy Lake as the defensive coordinator and things like that, but it's hard to give 100% credit to Jimmy Lake for his development, given that he was more focused on the DBs. But Jimmy Lake as a DC hire, overall thoughts, I want to believe in Raheem Morris. I've heard nothing but great things about Raheem Morris's character and his leadership and how everywhere he goes, everyone is absolutely certain that he is overdue for another head coaching stint. So I want to believe that Raheem Morris is making good hires. Ultimately, I can't say definitively one way or another in January whether these are great moves or bad moves. One thing that does come to mind is for Raheem Morris, this is his second head coaching stint. But it's been so long since the first one with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and if you want to count the interim job he did with Atlanta, but he didn't build a staff as the interim Atlanta Falcons head coach. So I would have thought he might bring in some more experienced coordinators, not first-time OC Zac Robinson, first-time DC Jimmy Lake, right? I thought we might see him build a staff with some experience under their belt so that not the OC and the DC and not necessarily the head coach, but head coach that hasn't been a head coach for well over a decade are all going through some growing pains together, right? That's my biggest qualm or fear with the coordinator hires that have been made by Raheem Morris. I think these are all very respectable and pursued candidates, especially more so Zac Robinson. Haven't heard too much about Jimmy Lake, but if we're nitpicking or if we're identifying like, hey, if this were to go wrong, Why would it go wrong? Not having the experience, that does concern me a little bit. But ultimately, I'm going to be rallying around Raheem Morris. I want this hire to work out for Falcons fans. I do think Raheem Morris can make a good head coach, and a lot of becoming a good head coach is making good coordinator hires. I mean, sure, you have Andy Reid and Bill Belichick, who it doesn't matter who their OC or DC is, they continue to churn out wins and Super Bowls and whatnot. But from the rest of the coaching world, it is important to have a good staff, because you do see often head coaches have great years and then their coordinators get poached. And a prime example of that is the Philadelphia Eagles, right? They lost their OC and their DC, Shane Steichen and Jonathan Gannon, and the very next season, the offense is worse and the defense is worse. So I don't want to just gloss over these coordinator hires and ultimately focus all the attention on Raheem Morris for the success in 2024 for Atlanta. No, you got to nail these hires. Another thing is the retaining of Marquice Williams. So I like this move for Raheem, because I don't think special teams in Atlanta has been a problem over the last couple of years. I know special teams is a third of the game, but it's called special teams for a reason, right? It's so different than offense and defense, and Arthur Smith was ultimately graded on his team's offensive performance. So with a new coach coming in, sure, there's a lot of issues with the offense last year, and the defense definitely needs some tweaking and things like that. They're not a finished product. But overall, special teams, the last couple of years, like, you made Younghoe Koo into a top 5 kicker. Punt and kick returns are really tough to evaluate these days with all the recent league rule changes on that side of the football. But I like that Morris is not coming in here and just blowing it up, because this wasn't an organization or a front office or a coaching staff that truly needed to be gutted, clean house, out with the old, we're changing the carpets. There were a lot of good things from the last couple of years, right? Winning 7 games is not what you strive to do. And that's ultimately what, it was the death blow for Arthur Smith, 3 straight 7-win seasons. But in 3 straight 7-win seasons, you can look at that and go, we could be a lot worse, right? There are some good pieces here. I don't think we have to completely dismantle the Atlanta Falcons. So I like that Raheem Morris is looking at his coaching staff, or what's left of Arthur Smith's coaching staff, and he's keeping the good pieces. So to wrap up the video, that is the Atlanta Falcons coordinator hires. By the way, before we get on out of here, I was supposed to do this earlier, so now my boss is going to get mad at me. But today's video sponsor was Prize Picks. So if you want to make some cheddar on the Super Bowl, download the Prize Picks app. And when you do that, you can go and choose 2 to 6 players and then choose more or less on their projected stats. Patrick Mahomes' projected stats right now, Prize Picks is running an awesome deal for Falcons fans where you could get it at half a passing yard, 0.5 passing yards. How could you not take the more on just half a passing yard for Patrick Mahomes? So you could pair that with any other selection, and you could be on your way to winning $250 from a $10 entry. So download the Prize Picks app, prizepicks.com/CLNS, and use code CLNS for a first-time deposit match up to $100. That link is in the comments and description of today's video. Now, to really finalize our at-home edition of Falcons today, now that the coordinator hires are starting to get finalized, we can get a good idea or a better idea as to who Atlanta may be targeting in free agency. Because the Jimmy Lake hire, for example, that's a hire where you come in with somewhat of a clean slate. Like, he's not going to bring all of his former Washington players to Atlanta, but he doesn't have serious ties to former defensive ends or guys that he got the most out of. So with Jimmy Lake, we kind of get a clean slate. And the same goes for Zac Robinson. Like, he has been the Rams passing game coordinator recently, but we don't have a ton of data on what Zac Robinson has in terms of familiarity with former players. So I'm really excited to see what kind of free agents these guys target, because I would assume Jimmy Lake, with his defensive backs background, will want to build his defense maybe back to front as opposed to front to back, right? He's got to find a new starting cornerback opposite of A.J. Terrell with Jeff Okudah, an impending free agent. So we'll see who he wants to bring in on that role. The safeties are pretty good in my eyes with Richie Grant and, of course, Jesse Bates. So I don't know if there's a whole bunch of redoing that needs to be done in the secondary, but all in all, this Falcons defense, I think last year showed a lot of promising stuff for the future. And now the baton gets passed on to Jimmy Lake to improve on what they had last year. And last year's defense, I don't think was a top 10 defense. And I don't think it was a bottom 10 defense. So now it's up to Jimmy Lake to kind of push it from being a middle tier defense up to that upper echelon. And for Zac Robinson, well, it's hard to really outline what his job status or what his job role looks like without knowing who the starting quarterback is. But it is definitely feed your stars. Bijan, Drake London, Kyle Pitts. And that's got to be the name of the game for Zac Robinson as he prepares for 2024. All right, that's going to do it for us on today's show. Let me know down below in the comment section if you have belief and trust in Raheem Morris and what he is building for the Falcons.